Hey, how's it going? I'm Nick, and I'm your host on the Echo Academy podcast, a podcast dedicated to uncovering helpful tools and strategies that help make your quality of life at work better. On today's show, we find out if mindfulness can help eliminate workplace stress. My guest today is Erin Lee. Erin is a mindfulness coach and founder of Mindful Moments Singapore. She's a certified mindfulness based stress reduction teacher as acknowledged by the Mindfulness Based Professional Training Institute of the University of California, San Diego, Center for Mindfulness. Erin also holds a Master of Science in Studies in Mindfulness with the University of Aberdeen, UK. She now devotes her time to conducting mindfulness training for corporate clients and organizations. If you'd like to find out more about Erin and this episode, you can go to echo.academy/Erin. That's ekho.academy/ERIN. I'm really excited to have Erin on as a guest today to discuss practical ways to alleviate stress. So, without further ado, here's my interview with Erin Lee.
That's right.
Erin, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thanks for inviting me, Nicholas.
So, in terms of MBSR,
Mm,
or maybe even we'll take a step back,
sure.
what is mindfulness? And then
Mm,
after we expound on that, what is mindfulness based stress
reduction.
reduction? Yes.
Okay, right. So, what is mindfulness? So, this is a really popular question. And if you do a search online, you get some basic definitions here and there. So, I'm just going to offer you a basic explanation of it, and then I'm just going to unpack it a little bit
Sure.
based on what I teach.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, mindfulness is essentially a practice. Right? It is not a concept, it's not an ideology, it is a practice. And it is a practice of paying attention. How? In the present moment, one moment at a time. And we're really paying attention to what is happening in our internal and external environments, right? So, because nowadays we're living in a world that's so full of distractions with technology and gadgets and everything. So, our attention is very often thrown outwards to our external surroundings,
Right.
and we are paying too little attention to ourselves,
Right.
our internal experiences, what's going on in our mind and body, often until it's a little too late, and then until we're really struggling or crumbling under stress or perhaps even burnt out.
Right.
Right. So mindfulness, in the modern context, it's really about learning to turn our attention inwards first, and just getting in touch with our mind and body to learn to observe ourselves. So when we pay close attention to the nature of our mind, for example, right, or our body, then we realize how much our attention wanders all the time.
Yeah.
Sometimes it wanders to the past, and then something happened, and we're just obsessing about it all the time, overthinking, overanalyzing, ruminating, or the attention could be wandering off to the future. All the times we're worrying about what might happen, and we get really anxious in the process.
Right.
So this, of course, is not ideal for our well-being, right? So mindfulness is really about bringing our attention back to the present, and not just back for a moment. We must learn to sustain this kind
Right.
of attention, and that's not an easy thing to do, right? But if we do have this kind of attentional flexibility, this is when we'll more easily notice what triggers our stress, perhaps what makes us stress, and we'll eventually learn how to change our relationship with stress.
I mean, is this a recent phenomenon though that we move away from mindfulness, or is this something, in your opinion at least, we've always not been good at as human beings? Even since our caveman days, have we just not been very
Yeah.
mindful?
Yes. I think our mind is pretty much built to notice the surroundings more, just so that we can keep ourselves away from danger and to survive. So part of our brain has evolved to be this way, right?
Right.
So naturally, we would throw our attention outwards more. But then now, because of technology and we're all glued to our devices all the time, our attention becomes so fragmented, then it sort of just exacerbates everything.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's more the fact that there's just so much that we have to almost download into our body that or into our mind that makes it harder for us to really pay attention to one thing at a time.
Yes, there's just so many external stimulations
Right.
that's sort of pulling our attention away.
Okay.
Yes.
And how did you get into mindfulness practice? I'm just curious about that as well.
Okay. Yeah, so this would have to go back to my corporate days. So
Right.
while I was still holding a corporate job, so I was doing public relations then. So I would, I was kind of an overachiever, workaholic. So I would get myself in these cycles of burning out. Right. So I would throw myself into my work. I would get really tired, exhausted, and then I would burn out, and then I would call it quits, and then I would start all over again. So this vicious cycle.
Right.
It wasn't only until some years back when I was holding my last corporate job in PR, and I was actually helping to manage an event. So it was a PR event. Everything was very glamorous, very glitzy. I remember I was standing in the middle of a ballroom with a clipboard in my hand, and I was just observing the event, right? As per normal, everything was running smoothly. And then all of a sudden, it was something very new to me. I just felt like the ballroom and all the people and everything external just sort of faded away.
Right.
And for the first time, my attention kind of zoomed in on myself. And that was when I realized and I discovered how exhausted my body was. It's almost like every cell in my body was kind of crying for help. Right. So that was really new for me, but it was also very real. Right. It wasn't something imagined. So I think that was what my body and my mind was trying to tell me there and then, that you have to do something right now. You have to change. So that's when I decided I didn't want to continue with my lifestyle like that, and I really wanted to explore something that would help me manage myself a lot better, mentally, emotionally, physically.
Got it.
Yes.
And how did you come about to mindfulness?
So that is when I started exploring different practices. I explored, so I started meditating, and I explored hypnosis, things like that, NLP, right? And then, of course, I came across mindfulness, which is the kind of meditation that I'm doing. And that really benefited me a lot. And I really wanted to share what I am practicing to as many people as possible.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And I guess maybe it's a little bit off topic, but explain to both me, I guess, and the listeners.
Yeah.
What is hypnosis and NLP?
NLP is neuro-linguistic programming.
Okay.
So I guess I'm not an expert in this, although I dabbled in it a little bit. I don't apply it. It's quite popular with coaches and businesses. It has some overlaps with hypnosis, right?
Okay.
So hypnosis is a way of getting in touch with our subconscious minds, and of course the applications are very wide. So you can use it for example, for smoking cessation, for weight loss. Some people do it for managing their emotions. Things like that. So the applications are very wide, but it requires often a hypnotherapist to guide you along, to facilitate along.
Right.
Yeah. So it often comes with an end goal, and it requires us to sort of enter a trance-like state to engage with the subconscious mind.
Okay.
Right. Yes.
Yeah. That's interesting because, I mean, my knowledge of hypnosis is probably the most inaccurate because it's always based on TV or movies, right?
Yes.
So
That's
it has a lot of negative connotations almost, or negative.
It does.
Yeah, on negative viewpoints, I suppose.
It
Whereas I
does.
think it's the complete opposite in the real world. Am I right to say that?
Yeah, so you have things like stage hypnosis where
Yeah.
people do it for entertainment. I'm not saying that it's entirely bogus, but there is some truth in that. But of course, in everyday life, then you see hypnotists and hypnotherapists, they're really helping everyday people with everyday problems.
Right.
So I think there's no negative, nothing negative about that. But there are, in general, negative viewpoints towards hypnosis. Yes.
Right.
Mm.
So before we go towards mindfulness-based stress reduction, um, I'm just curious on your thoughts on if you think mindfulness is for everyone,
Right.
and if yes, why, and if no, why not?
Okay. I think mindfulness can be for everyone if you allow it to, right? Mindfulness is actually very simple, right? All we need to do is to pay attention, but because we need to pay attention in a specific way, it is actually not an easy thing to do.
Right.
So later on, I might just bring through a simple practice, and you may understand why, right?
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah. So because we need to pay attention in a very non-reactive way, and we need to sustain this kind of attention. So it becomes very difficult, especially when given our state of mind nowadays, given our lifestyle. It's so hectic. We're rushing here and there. We're distracted all the time. So it gets increasingly difficult. So that's why it needs consistent practice. So the equation is really simple. In order to benefit from mindfulness, you have to practice.
Right.
Constantly and consistently. So if you don't practice, you don't get the benefits.
Right.
It's as simple as that. So practicing consistently, I would say, is one of the biggest hurdles that any practitioner has to overcome.
Right.
Yes.
Well, that seems challenging in itself, right?
I tell people it's
Yeah.
it's simple, but it's
Yeah.
not easy.
Right.
Yeah, that's the truth. Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's a very succinct way of putting it. It's so
Mm.
true. Like, and I often find the easiest things that are best for us is always the hardest to do, right? And just for anything, like practice, discipline,
Absolutely.
routine.
Absolutely.
All these
Yes.
things are simple concepts, but it takes forever for us to really get it right.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
and I remember, just to bring in a story as well, I went for a Vipassana meditation retreat.
Okay.
For listeners who don't know, it's a silent retreat.
Mhm.
And I remember the mindfulness part for me wasn't the problem, but what was the problem that came once you became mindful and once you were in a meditative state was the fact that now you couldn't stop listening to your mind. And then your mind, almost has this free reign to just all the voices, all your thoughts, they
Right.
they can run riot because you're no longer pushing your attention to anything else or distracting yourself.
Absolutely.
And for me, I
yeah.
think that's the hardest part. And
Yeah.
for me, at least,
Mm.
was the reason why I find meditation or mindfulness a little bit tricky for me, because it almost feels like I don't want to keep dealing with whatever's in my mind. But every time I put myself in that state,
Right. Okay. Okay.
I'm almost
Yeah.
forced to to deal with it. But,
okay.
but I understand.
Yeah. So maybe I could offer my 2 cents worth on
Please,
that.
of course.
So what you experienced is actually quite common, and a lot of us nowadays, we tend to think a lot and sometimes too much, right?
I agree.
So the when we first start to practice, and probably without proper guidance, we could get a little freaked out by how busy our mind is, right? And especially when you mentioned you heard all the voices, all the self-talk, and especially since self-talk usually isn't very positive. They're usually negative, or
Exactly.
criticizing, judgmental. So one of the so there are two aspects of mindfulness practice that we can learn, that we can master. So the first one is always about anchoring, right? So we need to learn to anchor our attention back to something neutral and something stable. And this is why, for example, in mindfulness practice, or when you go for meditation retreats, they may ask you to rest your attention and sustain it on the breath, for example, right? So if our attention is sustained on something,
Right.
like the breath, it's not wandering around, right? So even though you do notice all the thoughts coming in, but the bulk of your attention is resting on the breath. Of course, this takes practice, right?
Yes.
So when we first start to practice, we can rest our attention on the breath for like 2 seconds, and then it's going to go away.
Yeah,
It's going to
so
start
true.
noticing the thoughts again, right? So if you get frustrated at this point, the only thing that you can do is to bring it back, bring the attention back to the breath again. And then 3 seconds later, it's going to run away again, right? So this can happen like 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times in an hour practice, for example. But all we need to do is to keep bringing it back. So this is a form of attention training. So the more we train our brain like that, the more it gets used to being sustained and being anchored. So that's the first thing about the practice. The second thing about mindfulness practice is the ability to observe. And when we're talking about observing, we're not just watching, right? So imagine if you're watching a movie, right? And you're in a theater, you're in a cinema, and you're really engrossed in the movie. You cry along with the plot, the storylines, you get angry, you get worked up. So this is engaging with the stories that we tell ourselves. But if we are able to simply observe that, hey, I'm sitting in a theater. There's actually popcorn in my hands. There's a soda in my hand. I'm sitting on a cushion chair. I notice speakers. I notice people around me. Then suddenly the storyline becomes less distinct. We become less engaged, and we're just sitting there in the cinema, and we're just observing, the flashes on the screens, the colors on the screens. So we're less engaged in the narratives. And this is what observing ourselves and the mind is like in meditation and in mindfulness practice. So we have thoughts coming in, but we're not engaged in the storylines of the thoughts, the contents of the thoughts. We're simply sitting back and just watching the thoughts come and go, come and go. So this can be very helpful for people who are particularly have really active minds and they can't stop thinking or processing things. If we are able to learn to sit back and just watch the thoughts come and go, we can just rest in this awareness, this stillness. So that's how it helps.
In theory, I understand how
Yes.
mindfulness can help with stress reduction.
Mm.
But quick side note, what, in your experience, using mindfulness-based stress reduction, when you work with corporates and organizations, what are some of the things that really affect them in terms of stress? And those are the things that they're trying to deal with when they use mindfulness as a solution.
Mm. So reasons for workplace stress.
Yeah.
Okay, so to me, it is always an attention issue, at least from the mindfulness perspective, right? It's always an attention issue because we don't pay enough attention to ourselves. So we don't register that we are already burning out or crumbling under stress until it is too late. Right? So if we are able to learn to turn our attention inwards, to constantly observe ourselves, then that would solve half of the problem. Because, for example, burning out is not episodic. It doesn't just happen. It's actually a build-up over time. So we need to notice when we first become stressed, and we must, in time, learn to manage, regulate our emotions, and to manage any anxieties or any stress that we're feeling. Right. So that's one aspect. And the second thing is, I think a lot of times we like to think that stress comes from our external environments. And to a certain extent, that's true, right? So you may have endless list of things to do. You could have coworkers that you don't get along with. You could be in a job that you don't like. But from the perspective of mindfulness, it is how we relate to these stresses that really matters. Right? It is the relationship that we have with the stressor that determines how stressed we get. Right? So, for example, a coworker drives you crazy at the workplace. Yeah. That is in our external environment, right? But how we internally process our relationship with this coworker is the key. Right. So we probably can't get rid of the coworker, but we can manage ourselves. Right, such that when we practice mindful awareness of how we feel and how we think when we're engaging with this colleague, we learn not to engage with the unconstructive or the negative thoughts and emotions that come with the experience. Right? So in other words, we learn to give ourselves options. Instead of breaking down, instead of burning out, we learn that we have choices.
Okay.
Yeah.
And am I right to say that it's the problems that or the causes of stress is almost secondary to how aware you should be of your body and your mind, as you start to feel stress, because that's what mindfulness focuses on.
Could you explain what secondary means? Like,
Yeah. So, for example, like let's say you have a difficult colleague, right?
mm,
And the colleague is, just that mere interaction is causing you a lot of stress.
yes.
Does that mean that this colleague and the stress it causes you is secondary, because mindfulness focuses more on, um,
Mm,
I guess, your reaction towards it
mm,
and just dealing with yourself more than
mm.
anything else?
I would say that paying attention to ourselves would always come first,
Okay.
because we are not able to entirely control the external environment, but we can learn to regulate the internal environment a lot better, a lot more effectively, right? So we can't control what the coworker does to you, but we can manage how we approach that, right? So, and we would realize that there is always this exchange between internal and external environments. So if I'm able to regulate myself and manage myself with mindfulness, I would notice that the behaviors and the things that I say, right, would have an impact on my external environment, the co-workers. So it always starts from oneself, right? So it always starts from awareness of self before we can be aware of other people. Yeah, so that's where I think mindfulness would come in. It doesn't mean that mindfulness practice doesn't place a focus on external surroundings, but it's
Right.
just that it's good to start with the internal, because that's where a lot of our problems, the root of our problems are, where a lot of our stresses are being magnified.
Right.
Yeah.
And because you were mentioning um, that, or at least the second part of mindfulness is to observe, right?
Yes.
So, for example, let's say, and I'm just drawing from my experiences, and maybe I'm not thinking about mindfulness right, and correct me if I'm wrong.
Right.
But for example, let's say if I deal with a difficult colleague, for example,
Mm.
and it causes me to almost as a knee jerk reaction to get angry.
Right.
Do I observe that anger? And if so, I mean, do I observe the reaction that I give as a result of that anger as well, or am I
Yes.
supposed to just absorb the
Mm.
anger? How,
Right.
how do I
Okay.
how do I
Yes.
deal with that relationship? I
Okay.
suppose is my
Yes.
question.
Yes. So this is a very good question. It is also a deep question that we usually only address in the middle part of an MBSR program, an
Okay.
8-week program, right?
Okay.
But I'll just try to put it as succinctly as possible.
Yeah.
Okay. So what do we note? What do you notice about yourself when a coworker ticks you off? What do you notice about yourself?
Um, I think the first thing, and it's almost reflexive,
Mm.
is to call them out on it in some way, shape, or form.
Okay.
And mainly because I to be honest, I don't really get ticked off or angry with
Right.
anything.
Mm-hmm.
The only main pet peeve is when people do it in a very rude or
Right.
obnoxious way.
Mm.
And so I just call them out on it,
Mm.
for better or for
Mm.
worse, I
So
suppose.
how do you call them out for it?
Um,
What do you do?
okay. Well, it's been a long while since any of this has happened.
Mm-hmm.
So, let's say, um, um, a client, for example,
Right.
just be like, oh, this is supposed to be done in this
Mm.
deadline.
Mm-hmm.
I want it to be done
Mm.
regardless, or something
Right.
like that.
Okay.
And I remember saying something along the lines of something along the lines of, first of all, you can be polite about it. Second of
Mm.
all, you caused the delay. I shouldn't be the
Right.
one responsible for fixing that delay.
Right.
So I just call them out regardless of whether it's right or wrong. And it's always
Okay.
been my natural reaction,
Right.
just to let them know that it takes two to make a mistake.
Right.
Right.
And is this something that you would like to change, or are you okay with this?
I think absolutely I would like to change it, mainly because not so much that it's not, while sometimes I feel like it's right to call them out, it's not always productive to the relationship.
Right.
And you should always make sure the relationship is at the very least
Mm.
amicable, you know.
Okay.
So
Yes, yes,
yeah,
definitely. Yeah,
so
yeah.
yeah, so I don't think it's healthy, even
Mm.
though sometimes I feel like I'm entirely in the right to do so.
Right.
So
Okay.
yeah, so
Yes.
it's definitely
Mm.
something I would like to
Okay.
change.
Yes. All right. So just now you mentioned that this is almost a reflexive thing for you. So
Yes.
something about reflex is that it is automatic, right? It
Yes.
just bounces off you. And often before you know it, you're already calling that person out, right?
Right.
And you're only sort of regretting it after it has happened.
Absolutely.
So we want to be able to train our awareness such that we are able to backtrack, not after, but in the moment, in the process of it. So that's why I asked you the question, what do you notice about yourself when you experience this kind of stress? When, say, a client makes a demand,
Right.
right? So maybe if we are able to turn the attention inwards and observe ourselves in the present moment, when you read that unreasonable email from the client, for example, what arises in you first? What arises in you at that moment? Maybe this is just an example, it's different for everyone's experience, but you may notice anger coming, right? So that's an emotion.
Right.
Then I may check with you, um, where does this emotion feel in the body? And you may notice, oh, I notice my fist clenching, right? I
Right.
notice tightness in my chest, right? And then, oh, I notice myself having angry thoughts or negative thoughts about the client,
Right.
right? So these are what happens internally in us as we are processing the stress, right? And if we are not careful about it, these internal processes will manifest as external behaviors, and that's when we shoot an email to the client to retort back
Yeah,
or something, right?
exactly.
Right. So we have to sort of in a way, slow down that process for us. So, if we're able to notice ourselves and catch ourselves having these internal processing just before we shoot out that nasty email, right?
Right.
Then this is when we can learn to observe and regulate ourselves. So, let's say you're practicing mindfulness at this moment and you notice your chest tightening. So, this should be a cue. Oh, I think I'm about to do something that I regret.
Yeah.
Before I do that, let me just, for example, come back to my breath and let's observe my breath. As I'm observing my breath, as I rest my attention on the breath, I'm also notice negative thoughts coming in. But let's not do anything to these negative thoughts. I'm just going to sit here, observe my breath, and watch these thoughts come and go. So this process of observing is already enough for us to stop ourselves from shooting out the nasty email. Because
Right.
when we're observing ourselves, we are not going down the usual route of reacting.
Right.
I'm not sure if this is clear.
It
Yeah.
is. So it's almost like what you're saying is the observing should be to observe the parts of you that almost sends a signal to you that you're not going to do that,
Mm.
you're not reacting in the right way, so to speak. Right, in I guess air
Yes.
quotes here, but
Yes.
yeah,
Instead of right, I would use the word unconstructive or
uncon-
unhelpful. Right?
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
perfect
yeah.
word. So
Yes.
that yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, got it.
Yes. But this is of course not easy to do. So
Yeah.
when I explain this to people intellectually, it's very logical, right? And
Yes.
everybody agrees with me. But then when it comes to really practicing it, and they're like, "Oh, I know this works, but then I was stressed out again last week, and then it just happened. I just yelled back at that person, right?"
Right.
And this is because we haven't practiced it at all or enough. So we can't take mindfulness like it's a tool. When I'm stressed, I'm just going to take out this tool and I'm going to use it and I'll be fine. It is
Right.
more of a skill that you have to develop. So you can see it like why we learn swimming. For example, I always like to use this example. Why do we learn swimming? To prevent ourselves from drowning, right?
Right.
So you don't only start to swim or learn to swim when you're drowning. You need to practice it every day so that you can save yourself in case you drown. So this works the same way for mindfulness. We have to practice it every day to develop that skill, to notice ourselves, to observe and regulate ourselves. And then when a time of stress comes, we'll know what to do.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's almost like we want it to be mechanical so that we don't have to think like oh, I need to practice mindfulness to, like, I'm getting angry, activate mindfulness. It's more like a natural
It's
instinct
yes,
almost.
it's a skill, I would say. It's
Right.
definitely a skill. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, easier said than done,
Yes.
which I guess is a perfect segue to mindfulness based stress reduction.
Mm.
Could you maybe explain what it is, and also how we can practice it.
So are you talking about the program itself, the
Yeah,
MBSR program?
yeah. So the program, but in essence, like, what if we didn't have someone to coach us? Is there something we can take away from the program that you teach that we can kind of practice
Okay.
on our own as well, just in case, because you never know. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So maybe it helps for me to give a context on the program first,
Please,
and then
yes.
I'll probably bring you through a very simple practice or so. Yeah. So that'll be clearer. So the MBSR program, again, it stands for Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction Program. It's a lot of research a lot of research studies support this program. It's an 8-week program, 8 weekly sessions of around 2.5 hours per session, with a full day retreat in between. Right? So essentially, if you commit yourself to a program like that, it takes 2 months to complete. So effectively, you have 2 months of practice. Right? And this is considered a foundational practice. It is not something advanced, right? So you can go in knowing nothing about mindfulness, but hopefully after the 8 weeks, we'll be able to kickstart and sustain our own personal practice. So what we learn in the MBSR program is to learn to cultivate present moment awareness in both stillness and movement, right? So you could be, and in different postures, right? So you could be standing up in stillness, you could be moving, you could be walking, you could be doing household chores and you're practicing mindfulness. You could be sitting still on the floor, on the chair, at your desk, and you could be practicing mindfulness. You could be lying down on the bed and your mind is ruminating nonstop, right? And you can't sleep, and then you can practice mindfulness, right? So it is a practice that is very closely integrated with our moments in our daily lives, right? That should be the takeaway from an MBSR program. But of course, a lot of work goes into that, right? So before you even know how to practice it while you are speaking to your colleague, for example, right? You have to practice it relentlessly to get that skill. So this is what we go through in the MBSR program. And so it's not impossible to complete the program, even for working professionals, busy people. I've had many busy working professionals complete the entire program, and they have benefited from that tremendously, right? But it does take discipline. It does take commitment, right? But if we're not able to maybe you're still considering whether you would go for this program, you could try some simple practices. There are actually many resources online, right, that gives you a sort of like a taste of what it would be like to go for more in-depth training. They have shorter practices and everything. So I'm going to introduce a simple practice that you can do every day in your day-to-day life, right? So the listeners can do that as well. So we can actually start training our mind to attend to the present moment, to our present environment. So this practice would be really helpful if, let's say, you're having a particularly hectic day, so many things on your mind, and you can't seem to get your mind to stop running, right? So you could actually take just a few minutes, and we're just going to use our 5 senses to anchor ourselves to what is present for us, right? So we're using the 5 senses. Do you drink coffee or tea by any chance?
I don't.
You don't?
Yeah, I mean,
okay.
The only I don't drink coffee, and the only time I take tea is when they offer it to me at the massage. They're like, would you like ginger tea? I'm like, I guess I have no choice.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. But other than that, I don't take.
Okay, that's fine. So this practice would work with plain water as well. I mean, I'm sure you drink plain water, right?
I
Yeah.
do, yes.
So for the listeners, if you're a coffee person, you can try that with coffee. If you're a tea person, you can try that with tea, right? So shall we just run through the okay? So we have,
I'll just take the cup.
Yeah. So we have each a cup of water. All right. So it's really very simple. All we need to do is to pay attention to this cup of water using our 5 senses. So maybe we're just going to start with our eyes, right? We're going to use our eyes to take in the visuals of the cup, the water. So maybe let's start with the water. So if we're looking at the water, you might notice the color, no color, right? The transparency of the water.
See some bubbles as well.
Yes, absolutely, right? So if you pick up the cup and you just sort of very lightly swirl the cup around, you might look at how the water is moving in the cup.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And then maybe you may also observe how the cup looks like. The condensation on the cup surface, the color of the cup, the size, the shape. And then maybe let's get a sense of how this cup feels in your hand right now. So you may notice the touch of the fingers against the cup. You might notice the temperature, the coolness of the cup, the texture of the cup surface. Is it smooth? Is it rough? Right? You may notice the grip of the cup in your hand, the wetness with the condensation. Okay. So now we're just going to bring this cup to the nose and we're just going to take in any smells. So there may be smell for you, there may not be any smell. So if you notice no smell, just notice that there's no smell.
Now I understand why you suggest coffee or tea.
Yes, yes. Well, water works as well. So we are trying to just be with the reality of our experience, right? So if there's no smell, we don't hope that there's going to be smell. We just notice that there's no smell. As simple as that. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Okay. So now we're just going to take our first sip, and I'd like you to just take a very small sip and not to swallow it yet, and just keep the water in your mouth. All right. So you're not going to be able to talk, so I'm just going to do the talking, all right? So you may notice the feel of the water in the mouth, the temperature of the water, how it feels against the tongue, the teeth, the gums. You may want to lightly swirl it around your mouth, noticing how that feels like the movement, maybe the bubbles. Any taste with the water. If there's taste, notice taste. If there's no taste, notice no taste. And as you swirl it around, maybe you're also noticing that there's sound. Maybe there's no sound. Okay? And now, I'd like you to just very slowly, bit by bit, just beginning to swallow this water. And all this time, just noticing how the water trickles down the throat. Noticing the movement of the water flowing down bit by bit. Noticing the temperature of the water. Notice how it goes down into your system. Through the chest and all the way down to your stomach. And that's it. Yeah, okay. So I think we just spent how long? Just a few minutes just taking one sip, right? Yeah,
right.
yeah.
It's funny because the water is cold and like I always know, like when I feel cold, like I mean it obviously resonates or my mind picks it up.
Yeah.
But it's different when you're mindful of it. I
Yeah.
feel because you start to notice how the cold feels on like your hand.
Yes.
Whereas usually it's just like, oh, it's cold. So for
Exactly.
me, for me, that's interesting.
Yes. And you notice the difference, and you sort of get to reflect on how we're living our lives, right? How do we usually drink water in day-to-day life? We don't pay attention like that. It's very reflexive, right? You somewhat notice that you're thirsty and then you just grab water and you just jug it down like that. So we don't really pay attention. So as we're drinking water, as we're chugging down water, our mind may still be running about work, about the stresses and everything. So the mind is still working on that stress and it's not paying attention to the water itself. So this is a really helpful way for you to just take a pause from whatever that you're busy with, right? So you can try that with any kind of drink. You just have to ensure that you're not doing it with alcohol. I wouldn't recommend that. Because if the brain is intoxicated, then it's impossible to be mindfully aware.
Right.
Yeah.
So if I'm understanding it correctly, when we talk about mindfulness, and when we practice that mindfulness, it's almost just taking our thoughts away from the things that are causing us stress and to be in the present. But then what happens after we get out of that, or are we or is the goal just to be as mindful as possible throughout the whole day?
Right. So the intention of a practice like this, right, is to simply pay attention. Right. And we are paying attention to it with a lot of curiosity, this cup of water. There's no judgmental thoughts, right? So as you're drinking the water, maybe, we're just paying to the bare facts of this cup of water. But then in the process, we may notice judgmental thoughts like, oh, I don't like it. It's so cold. Oh, my gums hurt, right? Or sometimes for some people, impatience may come up. Like, why am I taking so long to drink water? It's just water. So in the process, you're also learning to observe yourself and observe these thoughts without further engaging in them. Right? So if you
Right.
notice impatient thoughts coming in, you notice that as a distraction and you just come back, bring your attention back to the cup of water again.
Right.
So this is a training of attentional flexibility.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, now it's just my own curiosity. I'm
Right.
starting to get into this, but but how, like, for example, is there a way, especially at the start where mindfulness is not very intuitive, for us to let's say when we start to get stressed, to kind of jog our memory to to go into this mindfulness practice and to keep observing it, because it's not something, and I guess that's what the MBSR is meant to do.
Yes.
But let's say, for example, I get really stressed, or I get really mad, or I get really tired, or,
Right.
or all these things, right? How do I just get in the mindfulness zone?
Right. So one word, practice.
Okay.
It's just this word, right? But of course there are recommended ways to practice. So you can see this as building a habit. If you want to build a good habit, you have to have certain commitment and discipline to that. We can't just take it as a very sporadic thing, like, oh, I'm stressed, oh, I need to remember to practice mindfulness. Right. It doesn't work that way, especially when we're really tired or when things get really hectic. We can't remember to practice mindfulness, right? So my recommendation is always to very intentionally, very consciously set a schedule for yourself to practice, right? So make the intention, okay, every day with my morning coffee or morning drink, I'm just going to take 5 to 10 minutes to just be present with nothing else but this drink. Right? And this is something that you could start your day with, for example. So you make it a routine for yourself. Every day, every single day, you keep up with this practice. And this 10 minutes will help you to build some of the skills that you need.
Okay.
Yes. And of course, with this regular practice, of course, you will remember it better. You remember the experience better. So when, let's say, towards the end of the day and you're getting really tired, and then suddenly you may remember, oh, okay, I could have another drink, and I'm just going to take 10 minutes. I'm going to just take a pause, and I'm going to drink this mindfully.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is there such a thing as things that prevent us from being mindful? I'll give you an example, maybe my example. So for example, in my daily commute to work, I'm always listening to music.
Right.
Yeah, and I find that is a great way to help calm myself for the day. However, that doesn't mean I'm mindful at all. In fact, I'm far from, right?
Right.
So are things like these, is the solution to eliminate, listening to music, or is it to find a way to incorporate it in? Does that question make sense?
Yes, absolutely. So if you're talking about, so how do you commute? What do you take the train or?
I take the bus.
You take the bus.
And well, I can technically take the train, and that's faster too. But sometimes I just like the
ride.
Yeah, the ride,
okay.
and the fact that I got my earphones on, and just not a care in the world.
Right.
Sometimes it's just really helpful to me.
Okay. So I would say that the experience of listening to music while we commute is very similar to how sometimes we just want to space out.
Right.
And we just want to blank out, and we don't want to think about anything else. And to us, that's a kind of relaxation, right? But then mindfulness is not relaxation. It's two different things, although you might feel relaxed when you practice mindfulness, right? So when people are spacing out, my question is, are we really spacing out? Or are we just allowing ourselves to, just allowing the mind to wander off to wherever we want to, and maybe sometimes to negative thoughts or unconstructive thoughts, right? So listening to music can be the same thing. So as we're listening to music, we may not be appreciating the music per se, right?
Right.
We could be allowing the music to bring us to somewhere far away. We're imagining or fantasizing about stuff, or the memory could, the song could bring back some memories to
Right.
us. So again, we're drifting in the past and the future, past and the future.
Right.
So what I could recommend, right, is if we set the intention to practice mindfulness, we really have to set aside everything else.
Right.
Right. So I would recommend that you don't listen to music. So maybe your ride is 30 minutes. The
Right.
bus ride is 30 minutes. And you may not be able to practice for the full 30 minutes. Just take 10 minutes out of that 30 minutes, right? Unplug yourself from the headphones and then just sit on the bus and open your senses to what may be around you.
Right.
And the easiest way to do this would be through body sensations.
Right.
Our body is the best way to anchor ourselves back to the present. So you might, for example, during the bus ride, you might notice the movements of the bus and how your body, is moving along with the movements of the bus, the contact of your body against the chair, or maybe as you're standing on the bus, how you're sort of just, you're balancing along with the movements of the
Right.
bus. So these body sensations are really helpful to anchor ourselves to the present moment rather than something like listening to music.
Got it.
Yes.
When you say anchor using our senses,
Yes.
do I anchor them with all my senses or do I focus on one?
You could do either,
Okay.
right? So, for example, when you were drinking the water,
Right.
you could have used your more than one sense at a time, right? Although we went sense by sense,
Right.
but as you're tasting the water, you were also feeling the water, the touch of the water.
Right.
So they could happen at the same time. But if a certain sense is more obvious for you, you could anchor yourself using only that one sense.
Right.
But of course, there are some things to note. So, for example, if you're in the bus and you decide, okay, I want to use the sense of hearing, right? And then you open your ears to your surroundings. So you could just notice things like, the rumbling sound of the bus. You could listen to the traffic outside the bus. But then at the same time, you could also be noticing that there are two people beside you having a conversation. Right? And then after a few
Eavesdrop.
seconds, you realize that you're eavesdropping
Yes.
and you're tuning into their conversation. And that's when your mind starts to wander into their storylines.
Yes.
So you're no longer present. You're being brought away from the present to other people's stories.
Gotcha.
Right?
Okay.
So things to look out for. So that's why I say one of the, so this includes like sense of sight as well, right? So if you're looking around, have you done people watching before? Just sitting somewhere and just watch people?
All the time.
All the time, right?
Sometimes it's my favorite hobby during lunchtime.
Yeah. Okay.
It's just great.
Yeah.
It takes your mind off things.
Yeah. It takes your mind off. Yes. It takes your mind off, for example, your work stress.
Yes.
But it doesn't still the mind. Because
True.
like if we're watching people, sometimes as we're watching people, we'll be thinking things like, what is he wearing?
Yeah.
Or we're looking at that bag. Ooh, that bag is nice. Where can I get that?
Yeah.
And then again, you start to wonder and think about things. So your mind doesn't really get a rest. So sense of sight, sometimes without the training, we can get carried away as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the same goes for in the bus. So
Right. Okay.
the best is always the body sensation.
So is mindfulness the best or the best answer to, or the best way to help our mind rest? Apart from sleep, I suppose.
I would say that it is mindfulness. The reason why I advocate mindfulness is because it is one of the most self-sustainable ways
Right.
I know. Because
Okay.
we don't need anything external.
Okay.
We simply need to, the popular phrase is to come home to ourselves. So we
Right.
just need ourselves. We just need this attention. We just need to practice paying attention to the mind, to the body. That's it. We don't need to go for a massage. We
Right.
don't need to go to a KTV. We don't need a phone to keep us relaxed. Nothing
Right.
external. Everything is self-sustainable here. And that's the reason why.
Yeah.
Mm.
That's a beautiful phrase, to come home to yourself.
Yes,
Yeah.
I didn't say it.
I
Right?
know,
It's
I
a
know,
popular
but
phrase.
yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. So you were speaking at the start of the podcast about that experience as when you were in PR.
Mhm.
How old were you when that happened?
How old? I was in my 20s.
20s.
In 20s. Yeah, I worked in PR for like 9-10 years.
9-10 years.
Yeah.
Ooh, that's
So the constant burnout for 9-10 years. Yeah.
so the Erin now, who's a mindfulness
Right.
practitioner and
Mm.
also a trainer,
Mm.
what would you tell the Erin back then to make her life more sustainable?
Mm.
Because not, I suppose not everyone might have might have the sense or maybe even the privilege to change jobs,
Mm.
or might have that freedom, at least at that point in life.
Right. Definitely.
What
Definitely.
would you tell the Erin
Mm.
of yesteryear
Mm.
to make to make her life in PR more sustainable?
Right. So I think just for the record, there is no regret whatsoever to whatever that I had experienced. I think
Sure.
whatever that I had gone through had resulted in the me today. But if I could give a piece of advice to the younger me, definitely, I would tell myself to start looking inwards.
Right.
I think that is one of the best advice that anyone could ever give to anyone else or to ourselves, because that's where we really start to notice and connect with ourselves, and we notice how we're relating to the world and relating to ourselves.
Right.
Mm.
And if you could elaborate on what looking inward means,
Yes.
assuming we don't know what that means, what would that be?
So looking inwards would mean to turn our attention inwards, away from external stimulations, and learn to turn it inwards to notice the state of mind and the state of our body, and to constantly observe ourselves in a very gentle way.
Right.
Mm.
That's perfect. Well, I'm also mindful of your time, but before we end off the podcast, I
Right.
just want to take this opportunity to have you explain what MBSR is, and
Mhm.
if they are interested in the course, how they could get in touch with you, because I think this is a really important course
Yes.
for people, especially who have chronic stress and stuff like that. So
Yes,
you never
sure.
know who might be listening and who could
Right.
really use this. So
Okay.
you want to take it away?
Yes, of course. So I had talked a little bit about what the program is about. So maybe I'll just give an introduction to where you can find the information.
Sure.
So the program first started in 1979, and it was sort of developed by Professor John Kabat-Zinn. Right, and when it was first rolled out, it was rolled out at a hospital, in a hospital setting. So these were patients with chronic pain, chronic illnesses. So a lot of them couldn't walk normally. They couldn't sit cross-legged on the floor. Some of them were in wheelchairs or maybe lying in beds. They couldn't move much. So this program really helped them to sort of meditate or practice mindful awareness in whatever postures that they're in. Right. So because it was quite successful. So over the years, the program has evolved. A lot of research has gone into it, and then now you see the MBSR program being open to many people, everyday people with everyday stresses, right? So there's just so much resources on the benefits and the research outcomes on mindfulness, although not all of them are equal, right? But what you could do is to research on it yourself if you really like to find out how this program may help you. I think doing self-research is more effective than me telling you what the benefits are. Right. But you can also visit my website, where I have some information about mindfulness in general and about the program, what the program is about, what you can expect from the program. So my website would be mindfulmoments.sg.
Sure.
And if you want to get in touch with me, then you can email me at Erin, Erin, at mindfulmoments.sg. I'm also on LinkedIn, I'm on Facebook, I'm on Instagram. So
all that good stuff.
yes, and I welcome any questions. So you may not ask me about the program at all. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have about mindfulness.
Sure.
Yeah.
And I'll put all those contact details in the description as well. So,
Sure.
So the listeners don't have to be remembering.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Nicholas.
Yeah, I remember this nugget because there was this one time I was listening to this. I can't remember what the topic was, but I really wanted to get in touch with that person, right? And he had this really funky name, I'm just I can't remember now, but let's just say it's Ezekiel or something. So
Okay.
it's like you can email me at Zeke at so and so. So I was like,
How
how
do
do I
you
spell this?
yeah, how do you spell that? Yeah.
I start to panic.
Right.
So it's always
Okay.
important to put that in the
Yes, that's very
descriptions.
thoughtful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, Erin, it's been a pleasure. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much for for this whole podcast, and also for hopefully helping some
Mm.
people understand themselves better, and to also find some ways to practice a bit of stress release and stress
Yes, I
reduction.
definitely hope it was helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for having me,
No
Nicholas.
worries.
Thank
Take
you.
care. Bye
Thank you.
bye.
Bye.